Hi, my name is Jim Parker. If you've been watching these videos for some time and you're finding the information useful and you're liking the videos, please do me a favor, take a moment right now before you forget and subscribe to the YouTube channel. I would really appreciate it. I really would. Thank you very much and enjoy the upcoming program. Welcome, fellow business brokers. I appreciate you joining us again today for another great webinar. Last week, when we were organizing and planning our webinar on the Payroll Protection Flexibility Act, I was talking with Steve Mariani, and we were going over all the information for the webinar. And he goes, "You know, Jim, I'd really like to do a program coming up on creative financing during the COVID-19. And I was like, "Steve, that sounds fantastic." Steve's always got a lot of great information to share. He always shares it in a very entertaining way. Great guy he is. I definitely wanted to bring Steve back. I thought it would be a great topic to cover today. So today we have Steve Mariani with us. Steve, how you doing?
I'm doing well, Jim, today. How are you?
Doing fantastic. I think everybody has heard this introduction again and again, but I'm just going to do it once more. Steve has focused solely on acquisition lending, personally closing over $1 billion in SBA transactions since establishing Diamond Financial Services in 1996. That's really, really impressive, Steve. Very impressive, $1 billion. He specializes in large goodwill transactions and utilizes the most aggressive lenders. Diamond Financial has become the largest privately owned SBA loan provider in the nation. Steve, thank you again for joining us today. I really, really appreciate it.
Absolutely, Jim. I think this is important. What we're going to talk about today, and I think this does lend some information as far as, these are some of the creative methods that we've come up with over the years and have used. And, we just want to share all those things because I think that any arrow that any broker has in the quiver is going to be important these next coming months.
Great, great. And what I like to do is, as always, we kind of got a format to this program is I'd like to ask you some questions first and cover the basics. And then what I like to do is bring on the attendees and let them ask questions directly to you or myself. But I want to do one thing different this week, Steve, is I want anybody that's listening, if you've got any ideas or if you've done any kind of creative financing or any creative terms in general that you want to share with the other business brokers listening, that would be great. I mean, again, we're all in this together, so we all need to be sharing information with each other. So Steve, what financing options should business brokers be considering over the next few months with COVID-19?
Well, here's what I'm thinking and looking at. There's going to be some seller financing. There's going to be a difference in seller notes these days. There's going to be some, I think, earnouts. There's going to be a lot of creative avenues that are going to have to be looked at over these next couple of months. But I really think that, and for anybody who knows me, they hear me speak against seller financing most of the time. But on certain transactions, that's just going to be part of our life, I think, over these next couple of months on maybe some of the smaller transactions or some of the ones that haven't recovered as fast. And so I really think it might be a combination of things, or at least thinking outside the box when it comes to putting the deal structures together these next coming months for sure.
Yeah, and I'm aware that you, Steve, are against seller financing. So why are you pushing seller financing more during the COVID-19? What's your thought process? I mean, I have ideas too, but I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Well, I think one of the biggest concerns is going to be what the effects are on the current financial statements of the business. That's going to be a big thing. If we know, and what I'm hearing from my clients is, well, I understand the industry and I understand that it's going to come back and I know it so well. I'm sure by November, December, January, it's going to be back to 100%. Well, that might be great if that's someone inside the industry that knows it really well. But when you're talking to an underwriter that's in a different city and has no idea about that industry and is just looking at the numbers, they may not get that many times. And that's why I'm saying seller financing may be on the table if that seller really has to go. And I do see some of that too, where the sellers don't want to live through this again. If they've lived through the financial crash of 09 or 10 or whatever, they don't want to spend another 2-3 years putting their business back together. And maybe it isn't in horrible shape, but it could be down 20 or 30%. That's still going to make it difficult for a financing scenario. So, they may be more willing to hold seller finance paper. And yeah, as much as I'm against it, what we care about is happening, making that transaction happen one way or another, finding a way to put it together. And that's why I think that's going to play a part moving forward.
Right, right. And I tell you, personally being a business broker for 20 years, I hear all the time in our industry that business brokers say, it's really important to get owner financing. We really push that owner financing. But I'm just going to be honest. Personally, I've done very little deals over the years where there was owner financing. I mean, it was either SBA financing or it was an all cash deal, and the buyer would come to the table with an all cash deal. And, I agree with you. Nowadays, if a seller wants to get something done in this environment, put a buyer to ease, I think the seller financing is going to, play a bigger role in this situation. And, we just got to explain that to them.
And like I said, I've always preached against it because of the effects of the cash flow. It's usually a shorter term. There's usually a lot of reasons, but now I think the sellers are going to have to be more flexible also.
Right.
Maybe it's going to be on a little bit longer term to make the cash flow work, and but I still think that's got to be on the table at least for the next few months in short term.
Right, right. And I wanted to throw that in there that I don't know about most business brokers, and I'd like to hear people, bring that up when they're calling in and talking and asking questions. But we do hear all the time. It's preached to us in workshops and in classes that we got to push the owner financing, and I just never been a big fan of that. And I'm sure there's other brokers out there that don't usually do that very often. So the reason I'm reiterating that is because for those of us that do not like owner financing and have never really pushed it as a business broker, during the COVID-19, we just might have to do that, and we have to retrain the way we think, and we're going to have to jump on that bandwagon. So anyway, Steve, you were talking about, you've been talking about creative financing. So what do you mean by creative financing during the COVID-19?
Well, it's going back to the basics and looking at the big picture. Where are we trying to get to? Let's just say it's a $350,000 transaction. Well, maybe it's going to be a couple of pieces. Maybe it's going to be some AR financing if it's got some ARs. There again, if the numbers are down this year, or if it's really been impacted and we can't determine when it's going to return to 100%, we're going to have some kind of creative method of financing it for the short term. Some of the things that come to my mind, maybe if it's internal, and what I'm seeing a lot of is if the business is in trouble, there is a key guy that can save it. That's either a potential buyer or somebody internal or whatever. Maybe it becomes a management lease facility until that particular person brings the business back up. If that seller doesn't want to be there and doesn't want to devote that time, which I'm seeing, then maybe they do operate under a lease facility, and he just leases the business until he gets those numbers back into place. But that's going to be one.
I'm sorry, Steve. I'm going to cut you off right there. Instead of selling the business, actually, the owner holds on to the business, and he's leasing the business to another person.
Right, and we can do that. Right, I've seen that done over the years under a management lease facility where he's just leasing it until those numbers come back. Now, what they typically write in that contract is, hey, the minute I can get the numbers to here, I'm going to pull the trigger on financing. What they're really trying to do is avoid, once they get into seller financing, they're locked for 2 years. For anyone who doesn't know that, in an SBA scenario, if there's a seller finance note, the rule says there must be 24 consecutive non-late payments. So if you do pull the trigger on seller financing entirely and make that change of ownership happen, well, now that seller note's locked in for 24 months and you can't do anything with it. So if we are just months away from it returning to 100% and making this a viable business for financing, maybe it's just a 6-month short-term management lease where he's running it to get to that December numbers where it'll cash flow and then get financed. But once they pull that trigger on a complete change of ownership and they do a seller finance, it puts them on hold for 2 years.
Yeah,
and that's what I try to avoid if I can, if it's just a few months. If it's going to be a year and a half until it returns, it's going to be a different scenario.
Right, right. So what are you doing? What do you suggest we do right now? I'm hearing that the valuations are going to be coming in lower. So how are we going to approach that, Steve? Because that's going to cause issues.
It is going to cause issues, and I'm hearing it already from the appraisal companies and the valuation people that we keep seeing all over the place. Well, there's 2 SBA rules that maybe some of the brokers are not aware of. And I know that the lenders are, and I know there's a few lenders on here, and they can help me out too. But there are 2 rules on the books right now that actually were put into place after the 9/10 crash. One of them says, as long as the business valuation amount is less than the loan amount, the lender can go ahead and close the loan. Now, that's an optional rule. They can say, no, we want that purchase price to meet the valuation, which was the old rule. Okay, so they can still abide by that if they want to. There again, you're getting into lender policies as opposed to SBA rules. But the SBA actually says, as long as our loan amount is less than the valuation, close the loan. Now, what you got to keep in mind is when you're talking loan amount versus business valuation, the loan amount is much less than the purchase price because you have any seller financing if there is any, but down payments, all of that is deducted from the project cost to determine the loan amount. Well, the loan amount many times is much less than the purchase price. So depending upon where that business valuation comes in, you may not have an issue at all.
Right.
And that again is going to be something that you have to talk to your lender about, understand where they are on this rule, and see if that is an option there.
Yeah, and let me give an example. So if you've got a business that went under contract for $1 million and it's an SBA loan, the buyer's getting an SBA loan on it, and let's say it appraises out at $800,000. But if the buyer is bringing $300,000 to the table, you're in good shape. You can get it through.
That's exactly right.
And it's been like that since what, 2015 or 2016, right?
12, right after the crack.
Okay.
What this was a reaction to was the appraisals coming in low and the business valuations coming in low. Because let's face it, after that 9-10 financial crisis, everything was coming in low for another 2 years. Well, the SBA recognized that and they said, hey, we're going to give you a little bit of leeway on this. As long as what you're financing and your loan amount is less than the value, you can go ahead and close. Before that, you weren't allowed to do that. You weren't allowed to put the difference in back then. It had to meet that business valuation number. So they said, hey, we don't care if you overpay anymore, as long as you're paying for it yourself. Right. And, and that really does help us out quite a bit. So if that valuation comes in at 800 and my loan is 799, we're good to go.
And I think the point you were trying to make before was that if your lender is telling you, no, the valuation didn't come in properly, that is not an SBA rule. That's the rule from their lender, from the bank themselves. Because we got to remember, the SBA has certain rules that they put, and they say, okay, if you abide by these rules, the SBA will guarantee it'll be an SBA loan, and the bank's got to meet that minimum, but they can then put their own, criteria on top of that. So you can challenge them is basically what you're saying.
Exactly. That's why I try and inform brokers, hey, know this rule. Most lenders will accept it and understand it and work. You shouldn't have to remind them, but others, right, you need to know the rules. This is an actual rule.
And another thing I don't think business brokers realize too is that when the valuation comes back, I'm going to give you an example. A couple of years ago, I had a pretty large size pool business listing, and the valuation came back and it was lower than what the sales price was. And, I read through the valuation and I challenged the appraiser in a very professional, respectful manner. I think that's the important thing. And when you do that, I think it's very hard to say, no, the multiplier should be this instead of that. You're not going to get away with that. But they were missing key information, or they didn't understand key information. What the pool company had done is they had increased their rates, and they had lessened the amount they got rid of a bunch of accounts that were outside their main area. And then they increased their rates. So their revenue stayed about the same, but their expenses went down considerably because they needed less people, less gas, less trucks. And so their expenses went down drastically. So when the appraiser was doing the appraisal on the business, they looked at it and said, okay, for the last 3 years, the expenses were this. And then all of a sudden last year, the expenses were a lot lower. So they normalized those expenses to what they were before. And so I went back and I explained to them, yes, the expenses are lower, but this is why they're lower. They increased their prices. The revenue's staying the same. They increased their prices and they reduced and so the appraisal was like, okay, good. And they came back with a higher appraisal. And the appraisal actually came in at that point higher than what the purchase price was. So, I think it's very important that us as business brokers realize you can challenge an appraiser, but you have to do it in a respectful way, but you can't really challenge them probably on the multiplier that they're using, but like on understanding the business. So if that appraisal comes in less than expected, read through it, actually read it and see.
Absolutely. You're exactly right. You hit the nail on the head too. Over the years, we have done that many times because a lot of times what the appraisal companies are actually looking at is just the write-up from the underwriter. And there may be auto add backs and things that the underwriter never accepted. And, the majority of the times we'll have add backs that we don't even send to underwriting. So a lot of times the business valuation companies never even exposed to a lot of those extra add backs. So I always suggest the first thing is make sure you get permission from the lender if it's lender ordered appraisal because it's their property. But get permission from them and contact the appraisal and just go through those. But I have found them wrong many times. I can't tell you how many times I have called the owner of the valuation company and said, hey, look at these 3 add backs that I think your person missed. And many times they miss them. Either they weren't exposed to them at all or they just completely missed them. But I've had addition mistakes in business valuations. So I absolutely agree with Jim as far as reading through that and verifying the information is correct, because many times, hey, it's humans. Let's face it, we all make mistakes. So I have picked up quite a few in the business valuation area.
Is there anything that we should be aware of right now in regards to SBA lending as business brokers, with the COVID-19 going on?
Well, it's the availability of the lender staff. That's probably the number one. And I do think they're coming back now. I am seeing most of the lenders back online now. The big question is always what the forgivable piece is going to look like. I'm across the board. We're seeing they want seller notes included now again, which I was, preached against. But the way we're structuring transactions right now through COVID that can supply SBA financing is we're increasing the down payments a bit from 10% to 15%, and we're usually asking for a 10% seller note right up front now. If we get 15 from the buyer and 10 from the seller at a 25%, it really looks, it's a 75% LTV to the lender. That's where the majority of the remaining lenders that we have are at. And like I said, as much as I'm against it, that's just where the market is today. 4 months ago, it was different. We were doing deals with 10% down all day long. But right now, it is a little bit more conservative just because the dust is still up in the air. Nobody knows. And I think that, when this all first started hit, the lenders came out and said, we're not doing any hotels, we're not doing any construction. Okay? That was the default blacklist back from 9 and 10. Well, guess what? Every construction business I've looked at in the last 2 months is doing phenomenal. Mm-hmm. I haven't seen one with numbers that are lower than where they were last year, which blows my mind. We actually went backwards to determine, well, how come so many people are spending money on construction? Well, they're stuck in their house. They're looking at those same walls that they've been wanting to repaint for years. And, but there are 3 construction companies we're monitoring that are all doing better. So, the lenders don't have a clue either. And they don't know where this is going to wind up. So I think just by default, they're saying, well, give us 15% down and put the 10% seller note. I mean, how much further can we go, I think, from a conservative aspect? But that's even our most aggressive lenders. So right now, and I can't blame them for that because I don't know where the world's going to be in 6 months either.
Yeah, it seems like all the lenders are moving to 15 to 20% down, even without the, even though the SBA is saying 10%. Now, the seller, if the seller is going to carry a 10% note, is that a 2-year standby then before they can start getting paid on that?
Not in my world if it cash flows. If I can support the cash flow, here's something else that I always do. And if they're only asking for that 10% so that they can keep their LTV at 75%, then I want to see the seller start getting paid right away, as long as cash flow provides. And I always typically balloon it at 5 years if it is longer than a 5-year note. If there is any kind of a cash flow concern, I'd put it on a 10-year amortization with a 5-year balloon or something like that if cash flow dictated that. But my thinking is the seller shouldn't be in the transaction longer than 5 years, no matter what. That's just a pet peeve of mine, thinking from a seller's perspective.
If you have a 5-year balloon, that you still have to get but when that 5 years is up, you have to get permission from the lender, right, to actually pay that off, or no?
Nope.
You don't? Okay.
Mm-hmm. As long as it's not counting toward the down payment, and then there's no restrictions on it. If they approve the note from the beginning, which is how I structured always, but every seller note that I've ever done, I've put a 5-year balloon in there. And they either sign off on the note and they don't, or they don't. But come that 61st month, that payment's due. The lender has no say in it. I try and take as much power away from the lender as I can. Not that I take it away from them, but I want the borrower and the sellers to understand it and be able to act independently without the lender's permission. So I try and describe the rules that say, hey, the lender won't have an issue or doesn't have any control over this particular item, so you can do it.
You still got to make it attractive to the lender, though.
Right.
You
Well,
know,
they're going to approve that note one way
they're
or
going to
another.
approve it, but yeah, you got to, the lender needs to, it's got to be a win-win for the lender as well. So we got to look at them I look at the people like you as my biggest ally in getting a transaction done. Is there any things that you're hearing from lenders, that certain businesses that are on a watch list?
Well, and I've been looking for that and asking them, and like I said, they're running to the default list, which is hotels. So it's funny because I'm drilling down on hotels myself these days, and you would think they would be dropping their prices like there was no tomorrow, like they did in the 9/10 crash, but I'm not finding that anywhere. They're all continuing, and I've done even more homework these last 7 or 10 days. They're all slammed. I can tell you the coast on North Carolina, you can't get a hotel room. They're all top
Really?
dollar and they're booked solid.
Really?
So, which goes against what you would think, right?
Yeah.
It's travel, it's this and that. But I can tell you, we actually did some homework and started calling places all up and down the coast to see, because I was a little concerned about the hotel industry too. There isn't one with a vacancy this coming weekend. So, um, it's just crazy. And that's why I say the dust is up in the air. No one knows where this is going to settle. But hotels, I would have thought right away, were going to be empty. But they're
Right.
not. They're not. You
What
can't get a house anywhere on the coast of North Carolina right now.
what other businesses are you seeing that the lenders are hot for right now? The lenders are saying, yeah, we'd love to lend on these type of businesses.
Well, we always love the restoration industry. I do quite a bit in the restoration industry. I also do a lot in the in-home healthcare industry. Uh, those that I'm monitoring now, they might be down 15 or 20% with those people still uncomfortable with them coming in the house. But let's face it, if you're sending an in-home healthcare provider to your mom's house who's 90, that's going to have to happen. She
Mhm.
can't stay by herself for any length of time. So she might get away with it for a week or two, but they're taking precautions, and I'm seeing those industries coming back. The restoration industry is what I'm seeing there is they're actually adding duct cleaning and some type of biology type cleaning, and they're offering that as an additional service. So that's an add-on. So I'm seeing that happen too. But the industries that we like, it's still going to be the same ones. I'm all about services. I like the service industries. I don't like big good overhead. And
I am Steve. I am so with you on that. I am so with you on the service industries. You and I could speak for hours about just that. I'm the same way. Instead of having that big overhead, that nut you got to crack every month, and plus the servicing industries are very scalable. You can scale them up very, very high without
yeah,
increasing your overhead. You can scale them down pretty quickly and easily during down times like it is right now. If you are getting affected, I'm sorry I interrupted you, Steve, but you hit a
that's
chord
okay.
with
I'm with you.
yeah.
I totally agree. I did a trampoline park. The rent was $22,000 a month. Was I nervous from the day he
Yeah.
closed? Absolutely. I
Yeah.
mean, how many months can you go without, getting 400? It was 400 was the number. Kids he had to see monthly to break even.
And
Those numbers scare me.
you're on the hook as a business owner if it's a 5-year lease for million plus, a million plus.
$22,000 a month.
That's
Yeah.
crazy.
Yep. So, those scare me. Those are the ones that I think, 3, 4 months without kids, how much trouble are you in?
Yeah.
So service, which is why I like the restoration industry, most of that is scalable. Like you said, most is subcontract labor. You're not paying a great overhead. So those are the type of industries that I like and the lenders like. We do some transportation lenders. There are some that like transportation. We're not huge about real estate. There again, like you said, I look at real estate as a huge investment that doesn't really generate a whole bunch of cash flow. When I include real estate, I look at it as a tool. Yeah, you have to operate out of something, and you have to have a desk and a computer. Those are all tools.
Yeah.
So, but
I'm hearing also the independent pharmacies, the independent pharmacies they're really hot on, and manufacturing businesses. A lot of the manufacturing businesses out there, construction businesses. So
there's a lot of industries that weren't affected. I mean, we're seeing deals that we're still doing well. Now, don't get me wrong. I do have a restaurant that I'm going to try and get done.
yeah.
That and really more for I got to find out if I can get this done. 30-year-old restaurant, great real estate, super management, and is back to 65 or 70% of volume. But I think deals like that should happen. I'm thinking that this restaurant is one of the 20% that are going to live because the lenders are thinking 80 up to 80% of restaurants might change hands through this.
Yeah, I had a lot of hot restaurants that I was really hot on before the COVID-19, and I've kind of backed off of them. It's just me personally don't want to deal with that. So how do you think earnouts are going to be affected over the next few months with the COVID-19? Steve, how do you think that'll play into everything?
Well, it's funny because they outlawed earnouts back in 13 or 12 or whenever it was. They put the down payment requirements in, and I do think earnouts are going to play a factor. I'm seeing earnouts being brought into the transactions we were in process of handling already, and I'm seeing the sellers being okay with it. They're basically saying, well, hey, if the business comes back, we're fine. But if the business doesn't come back or comes back at a reduced level, you're going to have to help us on some level because it does affect the purchase price.
Right.
So, one of the transactions that I'm working on, the landlord is actually the seller, and what the buyer negotiated was the lease is affected if the business doesn't come back. So his lease payments actually drop over the next couple of years. But I thought that was pretty creative. But I do think that, if a seller doesn't want to live through this for a year or 2 years or however long it takes to get that business back together, that there's going to be some kind of an earnout or something that says, hey, if it doesn't come back, I mean, let's face it, we're doing transactions in the middle of this when the businesses we know are down 60%, 40%.
Yeah.
Well, do you want to stop that transaction or do you want to find a way to make it work? So an earnout's a good avenue to say, well, hey, if it does come back, then we're whole. If it doesn't come back, then we're all still in this together, working together. And I'm seeing much less pushback from the sellers, and they're all pretty much agreeing to something like this because they get it too.
Yeah, it's reality. If you want to try to get out of your business right now and you're down 40%, you can't get out of your business on the numbers that were done last year because you're down 40%. So, it's helping out the buyer, it's putting the buyer at ease. And then on the other hand, as a seller, when the business, if the business does climb back up, which the seller thinks it will, you're going to see the rewards of that. So I think I think I agree with you.
Yeah. Yeah, and I do see a couple of the questions there, and somebody did say it's against the rules for SBA, and that is correct.
Yeah, it is.
When I talk about earnouts, that's going to be in a seller finance transaction. It's not going to be in, what in mine, it was really a rent reduction. So it wasn't per se an earnout. It was a rent reduction because it was a big facility and the rent was $220,000 a year. So, in my scenario, the landlord can agree to a rent reduction, which is a great thing. But earnouts, and the real upside for that, earnouts typically have an upside for the seller post-closing, which is one of the reasons why SBA doesn't allow earnouts, because that's a post-closing price change, and that's against the SBA rules. So when I talk earnouts, that's usually in a seller finance transaction. It's not in an SBA transaction. It can't be.
And let's make that clear. We're not talking today, not talking just about SBA loans. We're talking about, financing period.
Right.
Whether the SBA is included or not. And again, the earnouts, you cannot do that, but you can do forgivable seller notes with the SBA, right? That's
my alternative to earnouts in an SBA world.
They're not getting any upside to it,
Right.
but that's a good situation right here during the COVID-19. So if you could tell the audience a little bit about that, Steve, forgivable seller notes and how that works with the SBA. How it works with the SBA, if you don't mind.
We are getting into some gray area here. So this is going to be lender specific, but the majority of our lenders, we don't have a lender that won't accept them, but there are some out there that won't accept forgivable promissory notes. So what I personally did was, once they outlawed earnouts, and I did feel that there was a need for earnouts, I used earnouts prior to the rule change for aggressively growing companies or companies that have outgrown the seller or signed a new contract that the seller knew he couldn't handle. We needed new ownership in there to handle the contract. So there, it was a great avenue to have that seller capitalize on that new relationship or that new contract or whatever else post-closing. So I did always feel that earnouts had a place in this world. I wasn't against them. So once they outlawed them, I got in touch with the SBA and I said, I need to understand exactly what your issues are with earnouts, because I believe in them for certain scenarios. And what they came back to me was there are two factors that they struggled with. One is typically when you put an earnout or included it in a transaction, that earnout amount comes off of the purchase price. And they said, we just instilled a minimum down payment. And this was back when the down payment minimum was 25%. They said, we just put a down payment minimum in there. And by you carving it out into an earnout, you're messing with our down payment amount. So I said, okay, I get that. They said, the second thing we have an issue with is when you do the business valuation, you're also reducing it by that amount of earnout. So we don't want that. So I said, so let me get this straight. So if I include the entire purchase price and base the down payment on that, and I make sure that the business valuation covers the entire purchase price, including that piece, can I call it a forgivable sell note? And they said, we don't really care what you call it, as long as you abide by those two things. So what I actually created was a regular promissory note with milestones. Hey, the downside is there can't be any upside to the seller. So ultimately, if the business performs and meets all those goals, the seller only gets his original agreed upon purchase price, which was a little different spin than earnouts. Usually there was some kind of an upside if the business did even better than they had expected. So that goes away. But my forgivable seller note basically reached those two things. It included the entire purchase price, and the business valuation had to meet the whole thing. And like I said, it cannot count toward the down payment because it can't be on standby or anything like that. But if they don't meet those milestones, that $500,000 seller note maybe is reduced to $400,000. Whatever those milestones are can mirror what you wanted in your earnout. There just can't be an upside. You can't get more money. But that's what I created years ago, and I've been using that for well over 10 years. And my lenders are very comfortable with it, and I have no problem selling that to lenders because there's no downside for a lender. The lender looks at the entire purchase price and values that business that they do the cash flow based on the entire purchase price and all that money being paid. So ultimately, it can only help them, which is what earnouts did in the beginning. Hey, if we don't hit those numbers from last year, this money goes away. That's why I had no problem with the earnouts in the lenders.
Steve, I want to say something real that I think is extremely important, that people that do not do, a lot of brokers that do not do a lot of SBA loans, I guess is a really important piece of advice that I could give from one business broker to another business broker. I do a lot over the last few years. I've done a lot of SBA loans. And for those brokers that are listening that do not do a lot of SBA loans, this is the biggest advice I can give you. There's a handful of SBA lenders, including Steve, that I work with for my deals. And there's just a few of them. And how I pick those people that I want to work with are the ones that I can call up and say, hey, I've got a deal going on right now. I got this seller. I got this buyer. Buyer really wants to buy. The seller really wants to sell. I've got some issues. This is what's going on. And they're willing to take the time out and really talk with me and spend the time working and talking with me different scenarios and thinking outside the box and being creative and helping to create a situation where we can get that deal done. What I don't like is when I talk to a lender and they're just trying to get off the phone really, really quickly. You know, that's not how deals get done. And I reward the people that I work with and my company works with, my fellow brokers at my company and my partners. We reward those people that spend the time with us by giving them a lot of deals. And, you know, that's the thing I want to share with you, Steve, because I've been on the phone with lenders before and they just want to get off the phone like within 30 seconds. And it's a yes or no. And they're not really asking questions, or they're not even taking the time out to talk to your buyer one-on-one with your buyer thoroughly. You know, they're just trying to check boxes and get on and off the phone. Do you have any thought on that?
Absolutely. I agree with you 110%. I preach that all the time. It's your lender relationship, you know, and I actually even put out at one point, and I do it on a regular basis, a lender interview sheet. You know, if it's a new lender, here are the questions to ask, you know, and understand their level of expertise. If they've been in the industry 6 months, I lost the deal, and this is a true story. I lost the deal to a direct lender one time, and all I asked my borrower for was the name of the BDO or the salesperson at the lender. Well, I called his boss because I know everybody. And then they said, this is a true story. They said, Joe, well, he's been with us 6 months. We're hoping he writes his very first loan soon. And I'm thinking, this is a $3 million transaction. The buyer didn't know that because Joe sold him a bag of goods. And this was over a quarter of a point or something silly, which was the reason he went there. But the broker insisted he go and talk to Joe. Well, you know, these are things that you don't want to risk your deal over. You have to understand the level of expertise, whoever you're working with. If you have lender relationships, that's a wonderful thing. And you ought to be, and they ought to be honest with you. So that needs to be a give and take, just like you said. You know, if you're not getting a good feeling from your BDO and you don't think he's being honest, and here's a good test, send him a horrible deal and see how he responds. It's, oh yeah, we'll try and find a way to make this work. And you know it can't work. Well, guess what? That's a bad sign. But I know brokers that do that. They'll send them intentionally a horrible deal to see how they respond. Maybe not a bad way of going. We're honest with our brokers.
Steve, I think I'm so glad you added on to what I said about that, because that's the truth. Like, I want a lender that will, think outside the box, try to be creative with us, talk to the buyer, try to figure out solutions to get past that. But I also want that lender to be honest with me and say,
right,
on this deal, we're not going to get it done. We're just not going to get it done. And we don't want to waste each other's time. And I'm like, okay, good. And we know to move on from that transaction or show the buyer something else or whatever it is. But so I'm so glad you added on to that.
Absolutely. If the lender cares about you, they're going to be honest and upfront with you. They need you to know that. I tell every client, right? If we can't work together, that's okay. But we both want to know that today.
Yeah.
And that's the respect that the lender has to have for the broker. It's that give and take in the relationship, because that's how they're going to get the next deal, by being honest on this deal, whether they can do it or not. But we have the hard conversations with our brokers all the time. Look, these add backs aren't going to fly. This deal's not going to fly. The buyer's not, but it's best that everybody know that in the beginning. And that's really what I think is the difference between a quality lender and not. It's not their credit box. Yeah, it's an understanding of their credit box, but really it's a yes or no of what their credit people can perform or not up front.
Right. And again, I do want to circle back around from what my initial comment on that was, that I also don't want the lender to look for just the most perfect deals possible and that's it, and just have check boxes. I want them to be a little bit, creative in working things out and trying to figure out how we can make a deal happen and give suggestions on how to construct. A lot of times I talk to a lender before we even go to contract, and that helps work out the terms that we're going to put in the contract. So hey, I wanted to touch on, Steve, real quick, PPP. The payroll protection program. And last week we talked a lot about the Payroll Protection Flexibility Act that was passed at the time. And I just want to circle around for a few minutes on that before we go to the attendees. So, where do you see in the PPP now that you've had a week to digest the Flexibility Act?
Well, there's a couple things. And actually what was brought up last week was the credit elsewhere concern from Bart. And Bart had said he had read everything, which is why I didn't want to challenge him or bring it up on there. But actually, the credit elsewhere rule was waived for the PPP covered period. So there is no credit elsewhere concern as far as I'm concerned as the PPP covered period goes. But what they did do, and where I think that
Steve, I'm sorry. Just in case people are in attendance right now that weren't on the call last week, in 60 seconds, could you explain what you mean by the credit elsewhere situation?
Yeah. There is a rule in SBA that says if you have the ability to secure credit elsewhere and don't need the SBA, that's the alternative you should take. SBA should be looked at as the last resort. That's ultimately their goal, is for the people who can't get help anywhere else. That's why the program was designed back in the 50s. Okay, so that rule is called the credit elsewhere rule, meaning if you have credit and have the ability to secure credit elsewhere, you need to take it. Okay, so that was one of the things Bart brought up last week. Well, if you have a credit line that's not used, you shouldn't get the PPP and you should use your credit line, okay? Because he's saying that forgiveness may be in question when it comes down to credit elsewhere. They're gonna look at it and say, hey, you could have used your credit line. Well, that isn't correct, because the rule actually states credit elsewhere rule is waived for the PPP covered period. So whether you had the ability to get credit elsewhere or not is irrelevant for the PPP recipients. So that was important, because everything that I'm getting from SBA and the lenders who I'm constantly in contact with are trying to make the forgivable piece easier and not harder. And Bart seems to think that they're making it more difficult. And I do hear that from the CPA groups that I'm in, but that's not the case. And here's the thinking, how I see it. Now, there again, I'm applying logic to it. So keep that in the back of your mind, because we're talking about government agencies and everything. But the lenders aren't making a ton of money on the PPPs. There were 4.4 million written already. Okay, so they did train their staff to get the 7 check boxes and get them approved and get the money out fast, which is what the government wanted. But if they actually make them underwrite the forgiveness portion, it's going to take the lenders out for a lot longer than it did on the approval side. And no one wants that to happen. The lenders are already saying we're barely making a living on the loans we've already written. If you bury us now, you're going to put us out of business.
Steve, I agree with you. And
so number one. Number two, I also think Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Steve. I'm sorry. I didn't know you had a number two.
Well, I was going to say the number two is the confusing part to small business owners was, so let me get this straight. You're taking my 10 weeks worth of payroll and you're making me pay it out over an 8-week period. That was the big concern after everybody get their money. Okay, well, now you have the funds, you have 8 weeks to spend it. Well, it took me 10 weeks to show my payroll, and that's how much money you gave me. How do I spend that in 8 weeks? Number one. So everyone was kind of panicking about that. In the flexibility act, it extends it to 24 weeks, which in my mind, they did to just include a couple more 941s. You send in 2 or 3 941s, you don't have to worry about the utilities and the rent and all the rest of that. That could make up your other 25 or up to 40% now of the forgiveness piece. So I'm thinking that all of these steps were to make that forgiveness piece pretty much easy for both the lenders and the borrowers. Now, go ahead. That was my part two.
No, and I think that's great. I love your comments, Steve. I just want to expand on what you're saying is, I totally agree. And I'm coming from a common sense approach too. And I said that last week and everybody laughed at me. And I understand why everybody laughed at me, because we are dealing with government agencies and we are dealing with the government. But we got 4.3 or 4.4 million of these PPP loans out there. Mm-hmm. And you're going to make it really, really hard to get the forgiveness on those. You're going to kill, first of all, who and how are they going to go through that many loans? They're never going to be able to do that. You're going to put small business owners out of business. And the whole reason you gave these to keep them in business. You're going to jeopardize banks. They're making 1% off these if they turn into loans. And at the end of the day, it's an election year. What politician is going to make it more difficult to get these passed during an election year? So I don't know. I just think that, I think it's going to be a lot easier than what we thought, that what we were talking about last week, just from a common sense area. I'm sorry?
You froze for a second.
Oh, I did?
Yeah.
I just stood really still.
I was singing and dancing.
I'm just saying it's an election year too, and I just don't see them trying to do that in an election year, Republicans or Democrats.
Right. I mean, imagine if the forgiveness was really brought into question, and let's just say a third of those loans weren't forgiven. That third of those population will probably go to business, and if they don't, then a good portion of them are. And that's not the intention of the SBA or this whole program. So I really struggle thinking that the forgiveness is going to be an uphill battle, and I think that they continue to make it easier and easier on both the lender and the borrower.
Okay, great. And there's 3 points I just wanted to cover, Steve. Going back just real quick, maybe 60 seconds on each one of these points. Things we covered last week, just want to reiterate. Is the PPP, is it assumable? Because I know brokers are still confused about that.
All SBA loans are assumable. The PPP is assumable. Now, we did try to assume one in one of my transactions, and the lender said, no, we're not going to approve it. Why they did it, I don't know. I didn't talk to them. They weren't my lender. They were the PPPs of the seller, But I did see one but they're clearly assumable if need be. The participating lender has to agree to it. In this case, they didn't. I didn't understand why, and I didn't get to talk to him. But actually, what we did in that one was he closed it and she took it back out as fast as that happened. He paid it back. She took it out.
Mm-hmm. And you just got to structure the deal in a way that the buyer and the seller are aware that money's out there. It needs to be disclosed. And it needs to know, that that is a jeopardy at the end of the day. We might think that it's going to be forgiven, but, we can't guarantee that. And the parties need to be aware of that. And what happens if it's not forgiven? What happens if it is forgiven? Those are all things that we need to keep in mind when we are putting deals together that have PPP monies involved. And every seller that we talk to right now that we go under contract with, that's one of the first questions we ask is, do you have PPP money? And if you do, how much? And, when is that going to be used up? So the 6 months, that's still on the table.
It is still on the table. And what Jim is referring to is the CARES Act does include 6 months worth of payments if you close on your loan by September 27th. And I did clarify it is closed by September 27th. I was pushing them to try and get a PLP number by September 27th, but it looks like I've lost that. Yeah. So, it is, as the panelist, not the panelist, but the attendee says, it is closed and fully funded by 9/27. So, but that still gets us 6 months worth of payments for free. So that is still motivation, and we still have, the way we're talking to our clients is about a month to apply. I'm thinking if we get it in first to the second week of July, we can still make sure that that's closing. And 6 months worth of payments is a lot of money. I work on large transactions. One of mine is 249,000. One of them is 134,000. I mean, these are not small numbers.
Months.
Yeah, 6 months worth of
payments. The federal government's paying it. It's not being deferred. It's the federal government's paying the principal interest for 6 months, paying the bank.
Paying it. That's $250,000 to my one borrower.
We need to be closing a lot of deals by September 27th.
And think about the kick in the butt that the buyer gets. So he comes into it in September or October, and he's not making a payment until next, March? I'm not good with numbers, but February, March, April of next year. You know, that's a wonderful thing too. It's a great opportunity for him to save up some cash and get his operating capital under control and, you know, really start his business with a bang.
There was, you know, I was watching also last week, I was watching the video afterwards, and I think that there was some miscommunication there when we were talking about the EIDL. You know, people were asking the same question, and then there was some people that were putting in the chat thing, and I didn't see it at the time. First of all, the EIDL, if it's less than $10,000, it's forgiven, right? It's a grant.
That's my understanding. If it's less than $10,000, it's a grant.
And if it's over $10,000, then it's not a grant, and it's going to be a loan, and you got to pay that loan back. So as business brokers, and tell me if I'm wrong, Steve, if we go under contract, a buyer and a seller go under contract with a seller that has EIDL monies, we're going to treat it just like any other loan, where the seller is going to pay that off, and it's going to be free and clear on the day of the buyer's taking over the business, free and clear on the day of closing. Seller's paying that off. We know that the buyer could assume that because it is an SBA loan, right, at the end of the day. But we don't want to go down that. We don't want to go down that.
That's directly from the U.S. Treasury, so I don't even know.
Oh,
but I believe it is.
Maybe you can't do that.
I don't know.
But it should come out of the proceeds of the closing and just take care of it that way. But if it's less than $10,000, yes, it's a grant, from what we understand.
Well, here's something to expand on what you just said on the EIDL loans. If it's over $25,000, there are UCCs filed on the business. So you can't even conduct a transaction without that loan either being paid off or handled, because EIDL loans over 25 require a UCC filing on that business. So they will have a lien position on the assets and everything else.
Yeah, so you need to pay it off anyways.
Yeah, but yeah, it's treated just like any other liability. Like I said, it could have been a straight conventional bank loan. It's the same exact thing.
All right, great. We got a few things. Somebody chimed in on the chat. I'm going to read some of these chats, but in the meantime, anybody that's listening right now, I'd love for you to raise your virtual hand, and I can bring you in and you can ask Steve some questions. Or if you have comments on deals that you're putting together and you're being creative on how you're putting them together, we'd love to hear it. And anything I can learn, you know, I know I would love it. But I'll read some chat comments in the meantime. Somebody was saying that that was the case from up front when they did the Ruth Chris. When they remember Ruth Chris had gotten all that monies and things like that. So they're probably going to pull the rules on those type of companies, I would imagine, where they can't, that's not going to be forgiven. I think that the government's going to do it for those type of companies, right, Steve?
I don't know. You know, they're auditing everybody who took over $2 million automatically. The only place that they can really claim it's not forgivable is you didn't need it, because all those certifications, and if we're talking PPP loan, all the certifications are what they really hung their hat on as far as people being honest, because it says, you know, if you don't need the loan, you shouldn't get it, and you're certifying that you do and you are impacted. So I think that that's one of the factors. But I don't know. You know, I think Ruth Chris and a lot of those other ones just determined we didn't need the money, and it's the right thing to do because they were being put under a microscope. I don't know if they actually would have been forced to pay that back or not, or if that would have fallen under forgiveness, because I don't know the exact scenarios. But in my mind, they were keeping all their people employed. Now, it may have been, and this is something that's come up, it may have been more cost effective to not keep their people employed and not take the money. Right. And I don't know what their exact theory was, but right. I think they didn't want to be advertised as, hey, they took the money. That's really what I think it was. I think it was more of an embarrassment.
Right. That was bad PR. That was very bad PR for them. Very bad PR.
Yeah.
I'm glad this broker made a comment because, you know, I feel like I've been a successful business broker for 20 years, and and I always hear that, you know, we should be asking sellers to carry 50% owner financing. And I've never been able to do that. And I've tried all different things, and I've never been able to do that. I'm not successful at it. And I don't believe in it either. As I become more of an experienced broker, I don't believe in it. And so I'm glad this other broker said, he goes, I've been a broker for 8 years, no fan of seller financing, lots of talk, but rarely gets done. And that's how I feel, is that we're taught that in workshops, we're taught that in classes, but in reality, the real world, it doesn't happen very often. And if it is, we're talking 10%, 20%, maybe 25%. I don't see deals where they're doing owner financing of 50%. And when I do deals with owner financing, typically I have the seller look at the amount of equipment and the value of the equipment, and the value of the equipment that can be liened, so that you know, they have a recourse on the actual equipment. So that's my thing. So
well, that won't happen, right? If there's any kind of SBA involved, then that can't happen at all. Which
right,
is
I'm
sad.
talking about.
Which is why I'm against seller financing. I mean, he's going to have no protection. Everything that I keep hearing is, well, my attorney said if I hold a seller note, I'm never getting that money. And that's the consensus of, you know, the attorneys and the sellers when it comes to stuff. You know, if it's 10 or 15 or 20%, but right away, that's where it's going.
Yeah, but I do think that what we were talking about earlier, I do think we're going to have to take it more serious during the COVID-19, and you know, it will probably play a bigger role during the COVID-19, as much as I'm against it. So somebody was asking, how does a broker get paid if leasing the business from the seller? You know, my point of view is you take that business to the market as if you're selling the business, and a buyer and a seller get together and they decide that they're going to do a lease back instead. That's when my minimum commission would kick in. And there's always I got a percentage of what my commission is going to be, and that's going to be or flat fee of whichever is greater. And in that case, it would be my flat fee that would kick in, you know, $15,000 or whatever it is. Steve, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but
I do. Yeah, I've structured a few of these, and I do see the other question about the lease of the business as far as the liability goes too. And absolutely, the seller is out there liability-wise. So this isn't to be used just for any old business. It's basically where the seller doesn't want to live through this, or can't take the business to the next level, or can't even help it survive through this. Okay, so that's where you're going to put in a manager that has. I would get at least a few dollars up front. You got to take care of the broker, like Jim said, number one. But if the business is really in trouble and it's going out of business anyway, the seller doesn't have a huge liability if he's walking to begin with. So that's usually where I see that lease facility, where the buyer comes to me and says, I really want to buy this business, but it doesn't cash flow and I can't make it work. And when I drill down, I find out that the seller's been there for 35 years. He's plenty wealthy, doesn't really need it. He's basically ready to walk, but the kid's really gung-ho and can do something with this business. That's a perfect lease facility. You know what? Yeah, we can get you your price, but this kid's going to have to run it and do these things that he's been telling you. Usually it's an internal thing where the kid is seeing the business go down and knows what the things to do to correct it are, but the older owner is done and tired.
yeah.
But if it doesn't cash flow, they have to start thinking outside the box. And, at least if the kid can turn it around and make this better within a few months, we can finance it then.
Yeah, I've had my business partner, Tony Blair. He's a really good business broker. He's very creative. He's done a few lease back things over the years, and they're not short term; they're long term, 5-10 years. So it could be a good situation. I'm skipping some of the comments, guys, and I got to tell you, when we're doing the webinar, I can't read all the chat messages, but for those of you guys that are listening to this live, read the chat messages. There's a lot of brokers that really put great information in the chats, and it's information that I think it'd be beneficial if you read. Okay, so somebody asked, how are banks accounting for PPP loans that have been accepted by customers? Cash flow impacting during underwriting.
Well, it's really the big concern right now is, all those expenses, it's going to skew the P&Ls, no doubt about it, because you're getting the PPP money. It is not income, so it's not going to hit the revenue line item on your income statement. Yet, any expenses that it pays for with the PPP money also have to be left off your P&L. So what it's actually going to look like to a lender is, well, what happened to your payroll for 2.5 months or 3 months? You had no cost of goods because it's all payroll, and that's gone. So we're going to have to do some kind of interpretation on the P&Ls moving forward to understand, because PPP is a loan, it's a liability, should be a balance sheet item, not addressing cash flow. But like I said, any expense it pays for has to come off your P&L.
Mm-hmm.
What is the P&L going to look like with 2.5 months worth of expenses missing? If you're still doing any kind of volume, that money's going to probably drop to the bottom line and increase your profits. How a broker's going to go through that and properly allocate a percentage or the appropriate labor costs, that's going to be a Jim question. But you're going to have to do that moving forward. You're going to have to say, okay, in May, they did 60% of their business, but they had no payroll cost, but they should have. What is the actual payroll cost that should have been incurred to do 60% of the business? But that's where I think the biggest challenge is when it comes to the PPP money and how we account for it moving forward. But in theory, it should be a wash, except for the expenses on the business that aren't incurring.
Right. Okay.
If they're up and their business did the exact same amount of money as it did last year, well, then you're just going to see a huge drop in their expenses, and that's really going to skew the numbers.
What's somebody had a question. What do you think about daycares and childcare facilities during this time? I mean, my initial response would be it depends on the geographical area you're in.
I agree. We're doing one right now that I'm considering a startup because it was waffling before it, but it's a beautiful facility, and I really think it was all management driven. My buyer's huge daycare management. She has been in that city for years and years and years and just owns that city. So I'm attempting to get one done now. Now, the goodwill in that transaction is only $100,000. If I have to kick out the goodwill and call it a startup, I'm going to do that. That's really, just so you know, if there is no goodwill in transaction, it's a startup. Well, what I have here is an excellent buyer with a huge resume. She has 25% to put down, and it's basically a $2.2 million real estate purchase for a daycare. So that one I'm getting done. I think it's what we drilled down on ours was the geographic area, just like Jim mentioned. You know what? We know the area. We know they're all double income families. We know once everyone goes back to work, they're going to be dropping the kids off. There's just no two ways about it. Unless, half the families wind up staying at home. And even if they are working from home, do they want their 2, 3, 4-year-old or two of them running around the house? Probably not anyway. So the lenders are pretty optimistic about daycares. They really think that once the world returns, that the kids are going to return. Is that going to happen? I don't know. Like I said, I'm confident. I know this is right here in Cary, which is a very affluent, neighborhood. So I know they're dual income, and it's not a money thing there. So I'm expecting the daycares to pick right back up again. But will that happen? I don't know. There again, it's the dust is in the air still.
Great. Okay. Hey, again, guys, if you want to raise your virtual hand, I don't think anybody's raised their virtual hand. I'm going to start bringing people in. And until I see somebody bring their up, I think there's some, nope, no, there's not. If you've got a question, please raise your virtual hand. I'll bring you in. And in the meantime, I'll just keep asking some questions for a little bit. We don't have much more time.
Where is the hand raising? Where would you do that?
I forget. That's down by, and somebody can put in the chat message if you can. Do you know, Steve?
I don't. And I wasn't sure if it was a Zoom or a different, because I've been on so many different formats.
Okay, everybody's saying bottom center of the screen.
I'm not seeing it.
Yeah, give us more direction, everybody.
But it's at the bottom next to that chat. I have a Q&A.
Bottom, right next. It pops up when you, well, everybody's going so fast, I can't even tell. So just read the chat box.
I am. I don't think the 7A program is going to run out of money. Once we get to the end of this month, Jovita has the ability to allocate more funds if she needs to. So I did see that come up.
All right, great. Well, we'll bring in some questions right now. We got Charlie, and when I bring you in, make sure that you unmute yourself. You'll see your name on the screen, and then just unmute yourself, and then tell us what city you're from, and what your question or comment is. Welcome, Charlie.
Welcome.
Jim and Steve, how are you guys doing today?
Doing fantastic. Where are you calling from, Charlie?
Calling from Derry, New Hampshire.
Wow. Okay, great. Cold up there?
No, actually, rainy and humid today. So
Sounds like Florida.
not quite Florida, Jim, but we're getting there in a few weeks. Just wanted to say to you guys, I was on the call. I was at last week or 2 weeks ago with the other panelists, Bart and whatnot. That was very informative, as is today. I just wanted to follow up. I was the one that typed about the Ruth, made the Ruth Chris. That was, just so you know, that was it. You guys were talking up front before you actually officially came on, and I heard you talking. Mm-hmm. That was in relation to the credit elsewhere. With all due respect to, and I'm not here to defend Ruth Chris, Potbellies, or anybody else, but the SBA said all credit elsewhere test is out the window, as Steve, right, you said today. They said that it was out the window, and those folks took the money under those pretenses. Then everybody, a lot of people found out that these very big corporations with access to all kinds of capital in other places, the government and people, Secretary Mnuchin said, hey, you guys aren't supposed to be taking this money. Well, I say, wait a minute. You told them, don't worry about the credit elsewhere. It's, with all due respect, with a lot of these programs, a lot of this has been on the fly. This is unprecedented. I thought it was a little unfair the way that was handled, because basically, again, the people got shamed. You could sit here and say, should Potbellies be getting, PPP money? Hey, listen, that's not for us. They said that those folks followed the rules, as Steve pointed out. And then a week after people found out they got the money, and a lot of it, by the way, and a lot of small businesses didn't get the money. That's really where the outrage was. But those folks did not break the rule up front. That's what I think should really be the lesson
Charlie,
here.
I am so glad you called in, because you're absolutely right. You're absolutely 100% correct, and I really appreciate you, chiming in and saying that, because they did not break any rules. And I guess where my issue comes in is not just with them, but with banks. The bank that I bank at, and I'm not going to say the bank, but the bank I bank at, it's a very, very large bank in the United States, and they spent all their time working with major companies doing the major big PPP loans, and they left us small guys out to dry. And I ended up getting my PPP monies from a very small neighborhood bank, and I'm going to tell you, I'm not going back to that big bank when the COVID-19's over. And, I don't know, because I do think it was wrong. And I think the banks got, I don't know. Steve, you want to add anything to that? But I think Charlie's right.
I absolutely agree with Charlie. I'm glad that he brought that up also. Right. I didn't understand what rules they broke either. And that's why I went back to what I told Jim. I think it was just an embarrassing thing. Same thing with, who was it? The Celtics? I forget which basketball team wound up with the money too and gave it back. But I think it was just because everybody knew their name and put it out there. I didn't see how they broke any of the rules myself.
This is the thing, though. For years and years and years, you look at the Great Recession. Everything that was passed in the Great Recession was passed to protect the large companies, the major corporations in the United States. And I realized the CARE Act and some other things that came out, yes, we're protecting the major corporations, but these programs like the PPP, to me, and the EIDL and those type of things, that was designed, I think, in heart to help the small business owner. And for once, I felt like the government was coming in, and was it perfect? It was not perfect. But I felt like for once they were coming in and they were thinking about the small guys. And then to hear that major companies were sweeping in, maybe it was not wrong, but it bothered me as a small business owner, as somebody that's been working with small business owners for 20 years. It did bother me. So they didn't do anything wrong, but that's my feeling on it.
I get it.
So Janice, are you with us?
Yes.
How you doing today, Janice? Where are you calling from?
I'm in Phoenix, Arizona.
Arizona. Well, welcome.
Yes, welcome.
All right. My question is, if on the EIDL loans, if they're still issuing that. I have a client who, for a couple of weeks now, it keeps being told that they're only taking application for agriculture.
Yeah, that is my understanding too. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, Janice, they have, from my understanding, is they have shut down the site except for the agriculture consumers right now. I don't know if it's going to reopen. That's the big question. If they're going to reopen it to the world, But right now, you're right. You can only apply if you're under the agriculture SIC codes. Good or bad, I don't know. But they can still get PPP money if they're eligible.
Okay, great. Thank you. Alan, are you with us?
Hey, yeah. Hi, Jim. Hey, Steve.
Hello, Alan.
Calling from Jupiter, Florida. Steve, we spoke a few weeks ago about the unique business that I have for sale, that the charter fishing fleet.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably on one of the most famous corners in all of Florida, Las Olas Boulevard in the Intercoastal. And, you know, I discussed that it's a leisure type business. But I just got their May numbers in, working at a third of capacity that they're allowed to work at. They still made a profit of $46,000 in May.
Wow.
So, I mean, the buyer is willing to go up to 15%. The seller's willing to hold 10%. You think that's something we could take another look at?
I mean, those are the scenarios we're seeing every day around here, for sure. You know, it's going to depend on the big picture and what the global picture looks like. But what we're doing with a few of the businesses that we're having transactions right now is they are just starting to reopen at a certain percentage of capacity. We're requiring weekly, not so much P&Ls, but gross revenues. So I have the broker going back to 19 and doing March, April, May, and June on a weekly basis, just to data the revenue, and we're going to compare that to this year and just see on a weekly basis where that goes. I don't know where it's going to wind up right now or how it's going to be, but ultimately, in my mind, I'm thinking once we get past the actual required cash flow, we should be able to move forward. That's how I'm thinking about it now. Now, there again, what that does to the business valuation, what that does to the, you know, moving forward, I don't know. So, you know, the valuations are always a concern, especially if they're opening at, you know, a 50 or 60% capacity right now. But I'm looking at weekly revenues, and let's see how soon they can get back. We're seeing some open up and doing better than they were last year. So, you know, and we're also then asking for projections on what their opening is going to look like. So you're at 60% now. When does phase 2 open, and what is that going to do to your revenues? When does phase 3 open? So all of those things are playing into the transactions we're working on right now.
Great. Thank you. And we got my friend Brian Stevens on the phone. How you doing, Brian?
Hey, I'm doing great, Jim and Steve. Thank you guys both for all these great seminars you've all been putting on. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
I had a question about the seller note. Are you allowed to charge interest? And if so, are you allowed to collect the interest periodically before you get the note paid off? Or another kind, charge 5%? And is there a regulation on what percent interest one could charge if you can? Does that make sense, the question?
I think I got it. It's basically if the seller holds a note, what are the surrounding criteria requirements? As long as it isn't on full standby. And really, when I talk full standby, that means there's no payments of principal or interest allowed for the entire term of the loan. That's the criteria to secure that as down payment money. Once it isn't being counted as down payment money, there pretty much isn't any regulations aside from what is the effects on the cash flow. You know, we can't let them pay. Like I've seen buyers come in here and say, well, I want to pay that seller note off for $500,000 within 24 months. Well, that's probably not going to be supported by the cash flow. So as long as the cash flow supports it now, going back to your interest, hey, if it can support, let's just say interest only, then that's going to be okay. It comes down to the cash flow support of the business. What can it actually afford? So let's say it can afford the full note payment. Well, if it can afford the interest payment, they can allow that. You know, it's whatever that business can afford, as long as we're still covering the buyer's required salary, my debt service coverage with my coverage ratios. You know, once all that stuff is covered, then it's just a matter of what's available left as far as net income goes to get to that seller. If it's just interest only, I'm okay with that if that's the only thing we can do. You know, if he can make interest and principal payments, then I'm all about that.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that answer, Steve. Omar, where are you calling from?
Hey, Jim. Hey, Steve. San Antonio, Texas.
Yes, sir.
Welcome.
Steve, quick question. In the past seminar, you mentioned that the banks were looking at the numbers towards the end of the year, that they weren't looking that much to 2020 because it's all crazy. Now seems like things are changing. I just wanted to get your take.
You're referring to what we're looking at as far as the interims go for 2020?
Yes.
Okay. Well, first looking at the industry, understanding, or trying to understand what the effects globally on the industry. Restaurants took a bigger hit than service industries or even in-home healthcare, like I was mentioning before. They're pretty much 70 to 80% capacity all along this time. It's that other 20% that didn't want them in their house. So first it's the industry, but then it's going to be, we're looking at those phases and when they do open. Ultimately, we're asking for when do we think the business is going to get back to 100%? And it's looking from a logical perspective what it's going to look like. Okay, we all know our own cities and how it's opening up. And I can tell you the restaurants around here that are open at 50% are all slammed. There's a line to the door. Well, that's a bit surprising. A lot of the lenders thought, well, it's going to take a long time for the restaurants to recover. Well, now what they're realizing is even at 50%, they're all slammed to the door, line to the door. So, that's the piece that's unknown. The interims are less important than anything else because we have to underwrite off of the full year. Yeah, the interims have to cash flow, and we have to understand that. What I don't know now and what lenders are trying to understand is, well, what do we do with March and April if they were closed? We just cross them off? Do we take, the 6 months worth of P&Ls and divide by 6 and multiply by 12, which was what we used to do? Well, we can't do that now if they were closed April and May, 2 months out of the 6. So it's really an unknown thing how we're going to address the interims. My bigger question on your interims is, what are we going to do next year when we have 9.5 months worth of revenue this year for any particular business, or 9 months or 8 months worth of revenue? How is that going to be looked at? Because the SBA does require us to underwrite off of the last full year of verifiable income. Well, what the hell is 2020 going to look like? So I think right now, the way the lenders are approaching it is really looking at it from what do we think about this industry and how soon do we think it's going to come back? Restaurants, okay? They were first talking about 30 to 40% not reopening. Now they're up to 70 or 80% possibly not opening. Well, does that mean the other 20% are home runs? Every time we get a restaurant, should everyone jump on it and do it because they're going to be lines to the door forever because there's 80% less restaurants? Those are the unknown pieces right now. It's just hard to say. So what we're doing right now and what I'm seeing the lenders doing is compiling questions. They're putting questions together. What is phase one? What did phase one look like to you? What did phase two, or what is phase two going to look like to you? I mean, that's all we can really do now. So I'm suggesting to anybody that has businesses that are in this loop is to start asking those questions and understanding the COVID effects no matter what, because they're going to be asked of you by the lenders no matter what.
Yeah, and you might be in a situation too, like a lot of restaurants are being hit hard because, there's a limit on how many people can go in there right now, depending on the geographical area. But then you might take a pizza restaurant in that same area that's doing extremely well because it's takeout, it's delivery, and they might be doing, 30% more than normal. Well, I'm sure the lender's not going to look at that and go, well, that's going to be sustainable forever, right, Steve? I mean, they're going to look at it that way.
Good point. Right. Who doesn't know a Jimmy John's that isn't killing it right now? I mean, for crying out loud, they're off the charts. We use them 2-3 times a month around here. But so I can't imagine. That was a perfectly positioned company. Yeah, guess what? Right in the right spot, sweet spot. So, there are going to be a lot of businesses like that. And like Jim says, you're going to have to account for that too. I would imagine that their sales are going to start to drop after a few weeks and business start to open again. But right, we're all going to have to understand and really dig deep on all of these things to understand that business that we're selling.
Right. And, I keep coming back to this too. And this is why I'm not taking on, the restaurants and me personally as a business broker taking on the businesses that are not doing well, unless it's going to be an asset sale. I might get into that at some point because, or if I did, and I would suggest other brokers do this, is what's their position right now? If you're going to take them on as a listing, where do they sit? How much cash do they have on hand? How much are they blown through the PPP? Are they behind on their lease payments? Are they behind on any other loan payments? Because you don't want to be in a position where you take them on, you're putting a lot of time and effort into it, and then they're out of business in 30 days or 45 days later. So, okay. Scott, we got you on the line. Where are you calling from, Scott?
Boca Raton.
I knew that, Scott.
Listen, Jim, Steve, I just want to thank you again. These webinars you guys are doing are phenomenal and a great source of information for us workabees who are toughing it out in the marketplace. Just a quick question. I was on a webinar that was being conducted by another group, and they were talking about using escrow accounts to hold the shares of the buyer in escrow until the seller note was paid off as a means of protecting the note. Do either of you guys have any experience with those types of transactions, and can you give us any guidance on the do's or don'ts?
I've never experienced that. You, Steve?
I have not, and I can tell you that that wouldn't fly with an SBA. I wouldn't think, and I don't know if they're relating to SBA, but
no, not related to SBA.
Yeah, that's a little outside my ballpark. But I have seen even resignation papers held in escrow, where all they had to do was date them, on a seller finance transaction. This goes back a few years, but yeah, the attorney for the seller said, no, you will sign this resignation and turn this company back over to us, and all we need to do is fill in the date, and I'm keeping this in my safe because of the seller note. So I have seen transactions like that where they do, and basically that's what it is. It's keeping those shares in the seller's possession, or at least the availability to get them back whenever he wanted. But,
well, you just gave me another approach, Steve, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, I've seen that work.
Yeah, because the last thing the buyer wants to do is to have to put a lien on a note.
Right. So then that's why I saw the attorney come up and say, no, we're going to draft this entire document, and the only thing that's going to be missing is the date, and you're going to sign it. And it removes you from the corporation and relinquishes your shares if you don't make our payments.
Got it.
So Scott, you're saying the seller keeps the his shares of some shares of stock in escrow until?
No. In other words, what happens is my understanding, I've never done a transaction like this, is when the buyer buys the business from the seller, the stock that the buyer holds, the 100% or whatever stock that the buyer holds, is put in an escrow account, and the escrow agent will release it back to the seller in the event that the note is defaulted on. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
The only thing I worry about there is what happens if the buyer has created liabilities in the business.
Right.
Now you get the stock back. Are you now responsible for those liabilities? Maybe he hasn't paid payroll taxes in 2 years. Who knows?
Right.
Yep. And I'm also thinking, like, what's the benefit of that? Because if they do get the stock back and there is no outstanding liabilities, which there probably would be, I agree with you, Scott. But then there's probably not much of a business to take back over.
That was going to be my point.
Sure. Just have a lien on the assets of the business, and that's it. I mean, I don't know, unless it's a certain type of business that has like an X factor about it, that there's something in there besides the goodwill and the equipment, whether it's patents or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, there's no perfect protection, but the question is, to what extent can you insulate yourself?
That's interesting.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Something I want to talk to an attorney about. I just don't see what the benefits would be. And I agree with you, Scott. There's that liability issue that could be out there.
Right.
Okay.
But I agree with Jim, though, when you do wind up getting it back, what's left?
We're gonna have to go pretty soon, and I'm sorry, I'm not gonna be able to pronounce your name. Vasilis? Steve, you're very good at that.
I'm just guessing. Is it Basilius? I think I know him. You're gonna have to unmute, or at least hold down your space bar. If you hold down your space bar, it will unmute you temporarily, like Alan just did.
Okay, we'll go with Alan. How you doing today, Alan?
Yeah, I'm on for the second time. I just wanted to address that last fire. I just did a deal right before COVID where it was a stock sale for an IT company, and the attorney's holding the buyer and the seller's stocks in escrow, but the seller does not have to take them back if there's any liability, but he can take it back if there's clients there and he doesn't get paid. But yeah, I just did that kind of deal. So.
Yep.
Have you done that before, or is that your first one, Alan?
Oh, I've done stock sales before, but and that they've always done that. The attorney holds the the buyer's stock in escrow in case the seller doesn't get paid.
Okay. All right, great. I mean, that's something that, I'd love to, maybe I'm being negative about it, Alan, and maybe I shouldn't be. Maybe I should keep my mind open about it. I'd actually like to talk to an attorney about that. So that might be something we need to look at.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Well, we should probably get going, everybody.
Is it 3 o'clock already?
Well, I'm sorry?
Is it 3 o'clock already?
I think we're way past that. We're way past that. So, hey, Steve, I got to say thank you again. I really appreciate you joining us today, spending so much time talking to us. I really do appreciate that, Steve. So you're always got so much great information, and maybe you can tell everybody your website address.
Sure. We're at EasySBA, EASYSBA.com. But more importantly, it's all these participants that make the world go round. It's you guys that are going to take us out of this and move this world forward. So this information is the easy part. You guys have the tough part. So go and get us through this. Well, it's up to each one of you to make a difference in this world.
Well, Steve, you always make our job a lot easier by giving all the information and education that you do. So thank you so much.
Always.
So, hey, everybody out there, business brokers out there, I just want to let you know, next Thursday at 2 o'clock, we are going to have probably the most confrontational webinar that we've had up to date. We are going to be doing a webinar on the most controversial thing in business brokerage across the United States. And it's something that I have a big passion for. And anybody that knows me knows what that passion is. But I want you guys all to join us next Thursday at 2 o'clock Eastern time. We're going to be talking about co-brokering and the benefits of co-brokering. And what I'm going to have online is I'm going to have panelists that support co-brokering. And any of you guys that are out there that are against co-brokering, we're going to have a nice friendly debate. And I want you guys to join in and call in on the line and raise your virtual hand, and we'll bring you in and tell us why you're against it. And I just think it'll be a friendly debate. So please join us next Thursday at 2 o'clock. And until then, work hard, work smart, and keep making those buyer-seller connections. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.